The ballroom held its breath. 20 men stood in a perfect row, lawyers, executives, athletes, heirs, each one handsome, polished, and worth more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Richard Sterling had spent 3 months assembling this room, convinced that somewhere among these 20 faces, his daughter would finally choose a future. Isabella Sterling walked in, wearing a black dress that cost more than most cars, looked down the line once, and said nothing. Then the service door opened. A waiter stepped through, carrying a tray of champagne eyes, down completely unaware of the room. Isabella looked at him and said clearly, without hesitation, "That one. I choose him." No one moved. The champagne tray tilted slightly in the waiter's hands as he registered the weight of every eye in the room, landing on him at once. He was young, maybe late 20s, with a plain white shirt, dark trousers, and the kind of face that didn't belong in a room like this. Not because it wasn't a good face, because it was completely unguarded, carrying none of the careful presentation that the other 20 men had spent weeks perfecting. Isabella Sterling kept her hand raised, one finger pointed in his direction, and didn't lower it. Her father, Richard Sterling, was the first to find his voice. He was a tall man in his early 60s, silver-haired, and accustomed to being the most commanding presence in any room he entered. He had built one of the largest financial conglomerates on the East Coast through a combination of precision and patience, and he applied both now as he crossed the floor toward his daughter and said quietly but firmly, "Isabella, that is the catering staff." Isabella turned to look at him. "I'm aware of that." Richard studied her face for a moment, searching for the joke. He found nothing. Isabella had her mother's eyes clear, dark, entirely unreadable when she chose to make them so, and right now they were giving him nothing at all. He looked back at the waiter, who had set the tray down on the nearest table, and was now standing very still, with the expression of someone trying to calculate how quickly he could leave the building. The evening had been Richard's idea from the beginning, not because he was an unreasonable man, he would have argued the opposite, but because Isabella was 28 years old, ran the Sterling Group's daily operations with a discipline that made senior board members nervous, and had not in his memory ever introduced him to anyone she was seeing. Every conversation he'd tried to have about her personal life ended the same way with Isabella, looking at him as though he'd asked a question in a language she didn't speak, then redirecting to quarterly projections. He had eventually stopped asking directly and started planning instead. The Groom Selection Gala had taken 3 months to organize. Invitations went to 20 men, entrepreneurs, attorneys, a former Olympic athlete, 2 heirs from families the Sterlings had done business with for decades. Each one had been vetted quietly. Each one knew exactly what kind of evening this was, and each one had shown up in a suit that cost more than most people earned in a month, prepared to make a case for himself. They had done exactly that for the better part of 2 hours. Isabella had moved through the room the way she moved through board meetings, present, attentive, and entirely unreachable. She had listened to one man describe the Mediterranean itinerary of his private yacht. She had nodded, while another explained the valuation of his tech firm. She had accepted a glass of wine from a third, who then proceeded to spend 7 minutes explaining the wine. Throughout all of it, her expression had remained the same, polite, composed, and absolutely closed. What none of them understood, what they couldn't have seen from where they were standing, was what Isabella was actually watching. She wasn't listening to the words, she was watching the eyes. And every set of eyes in the room, without exception, had at some point drifted from her face to the space around her, to the room, to her father, to the invisible architecture of the Sterling name that surrounded her like a second skin. Not one of them had looked at her like she was simply a person standing in front of them. They looked at her the way people looked at a property they were considering acquiring, respectfully, calculatingly, with great interest in everything except her. She had made her decision before the first hour was done. She just hadn't known what to do with it yet. Then the service door opened. Lucas Bennett came through carrying a tray of champagne flutes, his attention on the glasses, his expression focused in the uncomplicated way of someone who had a job to do and was doing it. He didn't scan the room for important faces. He didn't adjust his posture when he realized how many people were watching. He just moved toward the nearest table, set the tray down with steady hands, and started to turn back toward the door. That was the moment Isabella stood up. She couldn't have explained it cleanly, not then. It wasn't attraction in the simple sense, though he wasn't difficult to look at. It was something more specific than that something in the contrast between the room she'd been enduring for 2 hours and the way this one person had walked into it without wanting anything from it. Everyone else had come here tonight with a strategy. This man had come here with a tray of drinks, and there was something in that ordinariness, that complete absence of performance, that hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. She pointed at him and said it out loud before she had time to second-guess herself. That one. I choose him. The room did not recover gracefully. Several of the 20 men began speaking at once, some incredulous, some visibly offended one laughing in the way people laugh when they're certain something must be a joke. Richard called her name twice. A woman near the back whispered something to the man beside her, and the man shook his head slowly. The waiter. Lucas looked from Isabella to the room and back to Isabella, with the careful stillness of someone who had learned not to react too quickly to things he didn't yet understand. Isabella walked across the floor toward him. She moved at the same pace she always moved, which was to say, deliberately without hurry, like someone who had already decided the outcome and was simply closing the distance. She reached him and said in a voice pitched low enough that only he could hear it, "Don't say anything yet. Just walk outside with me." Lucas looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and followed her out. Behind them, the ballroom erupted. Richard Sterling stood at the center of it, with his jaw set and his hands clasped behind his back, watching the door through which his daughter had just walked out with a member of the catering staff, and said nothing. He had built everything in this room on the principle that every problem had a rational solution. He was now revising that assumption in real time. The garden behind the Sterling estate was the kind of space that existed to be looked at, rather than used sculpted hedges, gravel paths, lighting designed to make everything look expensive, even in the dark. Isabella had grown up in this house and had never once sat out here voluntarily. She walked to the stone bench near the far wall, the one farthest from the windows, and sat down. Lucas stood a few feet away, still in his catering uniform, hands at his sides, watching her with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was in a situation he did not yet have enough information to navigate. "You're not going to get fired," Isabella said, "if that's what you're worried about." Lucas looked at her evenly. "I wasn't thinking about that yet." "Then what were you thinking?" He considered the question with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. "That you just walked out of your own party," he said. "And you don't look upset about it. Which means you either do this kind of thing regularly, or you wanted a reason to leave, and I was the most convenient one." Isabella studied him for a moment. It was a more precise read than she'd expected from someone who'd been in the room for less than 5 minutes. She decided that was worth something, and so she told him the truth, not because she trusted him yet, but because the plan she had in her head required him to understand the situation clearly, and she had never seen the point of building anything on a false foundation. She told him what the evening had actually been. She told him about the 3 months her father had spent arranging it, about the 20 men who had come through those doors tonight, believing that charm and net worth were sufficient credentials for the position being offered. She told him what she had seen in their eyes all evening, not interest in her, but interest in the name and the assets, and the quarter-century of accumulated Sterling influence that would transfer in some form to whoever she chose. She said all of this without self-pity, in the same tone she used when presenting unfavorable data to a board. These were simply the facts. Lucas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said,